Warning: some viewers may find this content disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised. What is the creepiest, most blood-chilling thing you or someone you know have ever experienced? About 10 years ago, I took my dog out for a short walk. We lived in a run-down but historic part of town. Old houses that are either beautifully maintained, abandoned, or generally going to shit. There was a good mix of people in that neighborhood. Anyway, walking the dog, I get about 3 or 4 houses down and stop at the corner while Pony sniffs some grass or whatever. I turn around and suddenly there is a man standing way too close to me. No idea where he came from. I'm usually very aware of my surroundings and Pony hated strange men. I stumbled a few steps back. I immediately had this absolute bone-chilling sick feeling. He asked me, "Is that a pit bull?" And I replied yes. Then he said, "Oh, she'll protect you." At this point, my body flooded with adrenaline and I turned to run back to my house. I saw my mom standing on the porch and thought to yell to her. She had no reason to come out on the porch. I honestly think she had a bad feeling. I don't know what good me yelling really did, but it was all I could think to do. Like, "Hey, look, I'm over here." I've never had such a flight response before or since that encounter. When I was about 6 or 7, we had this neighbor that would regularly try to invite me over for cake and candy, or to play with the dogs he owned. My parents didn't trust him, so of course, invites were declined. Years later, we learned that he regularly raped his 12-year-old stepdaughter and got her pregnant. When he went to trial, it was revealed that there were 4 other young girls in his past that he had abused. The guy used to decorate his house like a haunted mansion every Halloween, and kids would go crazy for it. I'm so glad that my parents wouldn't allow me to go there. When I was 16, my parents went out of town for a weekend. It was actually pretty sweet because I got to be king of the castle for the weekend. So I get home that Friday night and just dick around, internet, video games, etc., and start watching TV around dusk. The way our living room was set up was that there was a set of glass doors right next to the television that looked out to the back porch/backyard. The backyard was surrounded by ivy that grew on a hill around a 45-degree angle. So I'm just mindlessly channel surfing and I see some movement outside. At first I just dismiss it thinking it's a bird or a neighborhood cat or something, but I then notice that whatever is moving is way bigger than a bird or a cat. I go and put my face near the glass and stare into the backyard and there's some dude just crouching in the ivy looking into the house. Our eyes meet and he has somewhat of an "oh shit" moment and bolts out of our yard. Scared the shit out of me. My mom had a stalker for years. She was maybe in her early 30s, I was about 3 and my brother was around 1 when this started. My dad would leave for work in the morning, and as soon as he was gone, the calls would start coming in. She'd answer the phone and some guy would be saying all this horribly sadistic and sexual things about what he wanted to do to my mom. She was beyond frightened and didn't know what to do. Sometimes the caller would describe what she was wearing at that very minute or describe what she was doing. My parents were struggling financially so they couldn't just up and move, but my mom started spending more and more time at my dad's mother's house when he was away. The cops got involved but they couldn't trace the call. Finally, they were able to save up enough money to move. I was about 6 by this time. The phone number was changed and unlisted in the phone book. This was around 1988 when everyone still used landlines. My mom never got another scary phone call but she had nightmares about it for years. When I was little, I remember going into her bedroom in the morning and she would be sobbing into her pillow. I didn't understand it at that point but she explained later in life that she'd wake up from a nightmare and just shake and cry. A couple months after we had moved, the cops informed us that they finally caught the guy. It was our next-door neighbor's 19-year-old son. He had been in the military but was discharged due to severe mental illness. I guess he was put into some sort of special security home that specializes in mental health. The lead investigator said that the son was obsessed with my mother and they found a box in his room full of a bunch of photographs candidly taken of her when she was out in the garden or playing with us kids in the yard. It chills me to the bone when I think about it now. Anything could have happened to my mother when my dad was at work and I'd be too young to help her. On April 18th of this year, I came home from work and began working on some homework. After 30 minutes of homework my aunt entered my mother's bedroom and began screaming hysterically, ordering me to call 911. Once I was on the line with the operator, she asked what the nature of my emergency was. I didn't quite know so I entered my mother's bedroom to find her dead of a heart attack and laying face down on the floor, wedged between her nightstand and her bed. The operator dispatched the paramedics and instructed me on how to perform CPR. In order to do so, I had to flip my mother onto her back. When I grabbed my mother's cold, Lifeless arm. I realized that she couldn't be moved as she was wedged firmly between her bed and her nightstand, and rigor mortis had already set in. I was unable to flip her over, and I had never seen or touched a dead body before. After the paramedics came and told me that nothing could be done, the medical examiner informed my family that she couldn't be seen as she had been laying on her face for so long. It's assumed by my family that she hit her head on the way down as her dentures were on the floor beside her. The combination of her head trauma and the fact that she had been dead for many hours had rendered her unviewable as deemed by the officer from the medical examiner's office. To answer your question, the sight and feeling of my mother's deceased body is the most chilling thing that I have ever seen. Her memorial is this Sunday. Edit: I really appreciate the condolences and heartfelt messages you sent me. I'm proud to have a great support network, outside of the internet, full of people who have put themselves out there for me. I just started my move into my new home and will be sleeping there for the second time tonight. My new home is the spare bedroom of an old music teacher of mine. After his daughter and grandson moved out, I've been fortunate enough to be offered a room free of charge to live in. This is an amazing opportunity, especially for a college student whose job only offers 20 hours a week. I hope only to be able to repay him for what he and his wife have done for me. I've got one. In college I worked security for extra money. One of my regular assignments was the overnight shift at a metal fabrication factory. One of the primary reasons I was there was to ensure that no one broke in to steal all the valuable metal that was stocked on site, which was an occasional problem. That, in turn, involved checking the perimeter fence for damage at least once a shift. That couldn't be done effectively by camera, it instead required physically walking the fence. So it was that one night I was walking the perimeter fence in the middle of a thunderstorm. My attention was on the beam of my flashlight illuminating the fence as I walked past. So, I wasn't really focused on where I was walking, despite walking through grass that was a bit over my waist. Apparently I just stepped awkwardly on a patch of particularly slick grass or mud as I was heading downhill, but before I knew what was happening I had slid feet first into an open storm sewer. Some asshole had stolen the manhole cover recently and the edges around the opening were wet with rain and mud thanks to the storm. Let me just take a moment to explain this storm sewer. First off, it was shaped just like an oubliette. If you're not familiar with what that is, picture a concrete cell that is shaped like a jug, a small opening at the top with sides that slope inward to prevent someone from crawling out. In this case the bottom was maybe 10 feet square and the opening for the manhole was about twice the normal width in the center of the ceiling. There was no ladder attached and the fall was maybe 20 feet down. At the bottom the floor was sloped to form two trenches, in the shape of a cross. There were sewer channels going off in 4 directions, but they were only maybe a foot wide across and were blocked with metal grates. At the bottom, there were debris, including a number of large broken pieces of rebar. There were several pieces that were pointing straight up. I definitely would have impaled myself on several jagged points of rusty metal, had I hit the bottom. So, no way to escape, a long fall and a probable disabling injury at the bottom. I somehow caught myself by hooking the edge of the opening on my elbow as I fell in. I dropped my flashlight to the bottom of the pit before I stopped my momentum, so I had a great view of all that broken rebar below me while I was struggling to escape. Maybe that was the collapsed remains of the ladder? As I tried to get another handhold, my cell phone skipped out of my pocket and hit the bottom. It felt like forever before I somehow pulled myself out of that opening. I don't doubt adrenaline gave me a considerable boost of strength, but even so, I nearly lost my hold on the edge 3 times before I managed to scramble out. I was kinda just jerking my knees towards the opening and jumping a couple inches thanks to the momentum. My free hand kept scrambling for something solid to grab but I never really found anything. I'm honestly not sure how exactly I pulled myself out just using the surface tension between the mud and concrete in my hands and forearm. It felt like a miracle. All I could think of after I pulled myself out was how I wasn't due to be relieved for another 7 hours. 7 hours before anyone would even start wondering where I was, and that whole time I might have been trapped at the bottom of a pit, impaled on some rods of rebar, in the rain. I also wanted to kill whoever stole that manhole cover. I was 8 and woke up to an explosion of dog barks and screams coming from our backyard, then the screams trailing down the street. We get outside and my dog is chewing on a bloody shoe and a bit of gym shorts were hanging off the backyard fence. We call the cops, they investigate. From the footprints they could see the guy tried every window with my dog following. When he got to mine, my dog went full attack mode. The guy was picked up that night on an unrelated charge, but they put 2 and 2 together later and charged him. My dog allowed them to collect the gym shorts, but that shoe was his. He was happy and let the cops pet him as much as they liked. Animal control the next day when they drew a little blood for a rabies test. That shoe though was his. When I was 3, our home was broken into. The burglar stole money off of my parents' dresser, and then went into my room and just stared over my sleeping body. I woke up and saw him. My father watched him from his bedroom while calling the police. When the burglar left and the police were there with the lights on, his footprints were in the shag carpet. This is my earliest memory. I was home for the summer from college, and my mother and brother had just headed out for a few-day trip to visit colleges. This meant I was to take care of my father. Dad, something was clearly wrong, but we couldn't tell what. He had Parkinson's, but it was more than that. But we figured I could handle him. This is when I came to realize something in his broken mind hated me with a passion. He wouldn't listen to anything I said. Now I admit I was pissed off, so I wasn't doing a terrific job, but even simple things like getting him food was an hour-long ordeal that ended with us shouting. This last time, I called Mom on the house phone because at least he'd listen to her. I gave him one phone and I was on another, yelling at each other through it even though GB we were 5 feet apart. Poor Mom trying to referee from a few hundred miles away. Finally, Dad hangs up his phone and hands it to me. Oh, he's done, thank God, I think. But then he tries to take the still active phone from my hand, which I refuse. And that's when it happens. It gives me chills to this day. A change came over him. It was subtle, but he stood slightly straighter. It was like for a moment someone else was in his body. He stared at me, and in the most calm, cold voice I have ever heard, said, "I'm going to kill you." There was no emotion behind it. There was no energy. He said it as fact. I was stunned. Mom heard it over the phone. As I stood there, paralyzed, her voice broke through in a whisper. "Key, run." I threw the phone at Dad, rounded the corner and grabbed my keys. My car screamed out of the driveway. It was pure animal instinct from me at that point. I had to run. Because if I stayed there... Dad didn't really remember what happened. He was confused as to why I was suddenly gone. I have no idea what went on in his head at that moment, but I stared into something back there. Not necessarily paranormal, but this was something that both creeped me out quite thoroughly and chilled my blood to ice water. I was working at a crematory/funeral home at the time. I just picked up the body of a girl my age from the county coroner's office and was going through the check-in procedure, which consisted of lots of paperwork, fingerprints, documentation of belongings, etc. Now when a body comes to us from the coroner, it's typically an unexpected death that occurred under questionable circumstances. This particular one, I could tell by simply looking at her, was a drug overdose. She had very obvious injection sites in her arms, thigh, one on her foot, and what appeared to be needle marks all over her lower abdomen. It looked like this chick went to fucking town stabbing herself in the belly. This was strange to me, because I know that isn't a typical place to inject drugs, especially because this girl was a bit on the large side, nor is it usually a place where the pathologist will draw fluids in a case like this. Anyway, I shrugged it off and began to document her personal items, which come to us zipped up in the body bag in a black trash bag. Usually the coroner's office provides a detailed list of belongings for liability reasons. This case came with no such list, so it surprised me to see that she did indeed have a property bag with her, tucked under a leg. I tore the bag open and out flopped a fully developed, completely green, dead baby, with a very smooshed head. You can imagine my shock, opening the bag, expecting to find shoes, clothes, maybe a wallet, and instead a tiny human plopping out. Long story shortened, the family did not know, and telling them was horrifying in and of itself. There was absolutely no sort of documentation on this fully developed human, and the coroner was just as shocked as we were. Some jackass autopsy tech had just stuffed the baby in a bag in hopes of us not finding it and cremating it to save themselves some time on paperwork and dealing with an already distraught family. An autopsy was done on the baby, family and friends were questioned, the whole 9 yards. Later a friend of the deceased disclosed that she was the only one who the girl had told about being pregnant, and her plans to try and give herself a late-stage abortion by injecting heroin straight into her womb. Pretty fucked. Needless to say, I was always hesitant when opening property bags in fear of finding another dead, green infant as opposed to a pair of Nikes. Watching my big dog get hit by a car and go flying through the air while my neighbor's bigger dog got ran over and tumbled again and again by the same car at the same time. Bumpers were ripped off and pieces of the exhaust were all over the road. I was 10 years old, home alone, and had to run into my neighbor's house to tell them their dog was unconscious and lying in a pool of blood. P.S. Both dogs lived, but it was a long recovery for both. I was standing in front of the oncoming car, on the side of the road. It's burned in my memory. P.S. There was woods on both sides of the road and the dogs were chasing each other. I couldn't have known or prevented it. I used to take care of a developmentally disabled man in a community protection program. He had to be kept away from people because of his sudden violent outbursts. His parents were rich and bought an old farmhouse on 10 acres or so about 4 miles out of town, so that he could be away from the public and not forced into a psych ward. For 4 years I worked there on a 56-hour shift, come in on Sunday evening and leave Wednesday afternoon. There were 2 of us on these shifts and we were both supposed to be there the entire 56 hours, but because we were the most senior trainers on staff we'd take turns going home on 1/2 of the nights. After 3 years of being in that house I had become comfortable with it, despite it being so isolated and overall kind of creepy. I would always stay up and watch TV until around midnight. My client was always locked in his room around 8 p.m. One night, about 12:15 a.m. I turned the TV off and pulled the covers over myself to try and get some sleep on the nastiest futon ever. There was one window in the staff room and it faced the back of the property, and was about 6 feet off the ground. I had just started drifting to sleep when I heard the most blood-curdling woman's scream from right outside the window. I popped up so fast that I nearly lost consciousness and had to steady myself in the doorway while the scream continued and then faded away. I grabbed a flashlight from the laundry room and threw open the back door, illuminating the area outside the window, and there was nothing. I ran along the perimeter of the house and saw nothing. I watched the sun come up the next morning, desperately glued to the TV trying to distract myself from what had happened. All of the people I worked with were much older than me, and there was no good reason to play a prank like that in the middle of January in Eastern Oregon. I'm sure there's an explanation, but it bothers me to this day. When my friend's dad was around 17 years old, he decided to go camping with about 8 or so of his friends. This took place in the Wisconsin forest. When they got to the site, they decided to split up to collect firewood in groups of 2, and meet back at the site in around 20 minutes. One group wasn't back right away, and since they were a couple, they just assumed they were fornicating in some bushes, and cracked a couple jokes about it. After around an hour they decided they should probably go look for them, and headed off to search in the area they had been collecting wood. They saw behind a bush part of the girl's bloody shirt, and the man's shoes were lying scattered around the scene. They quickly rushed back to their car so they could drive to the park ranger's office, which was about 5 miles away, and report the incident. However, they found that their gas had been siphoned, so they had no choice but to walk. On their walk back to the office, they saw a semi pass by with one driver and 2 faces pressed up against the window, which they believed were their friends begging for help. The 2 friends were reported missing and have never been found to this day. So, this happened senior year of high school. My best friend and I were at her house, which was way up in one of the canyons, and she had a long, windy driveway. We had been there all day and her mom had gone out and she and I were supposed to go meet a couple friends in Hollywood that night. Anyways, we had been goofing around all day and watching scary movies and whatnot, and we started to get ready. Her bathroom had one of those his/her double sink deals, so she was near one and I was at the other. All of a sudden I got the creepiest feeling, like, all of the hair on my arms stood up and I had this sudden feeling of panic. To this day it is the most terrified I have ever been. I was putting on eyeliner when it happened and I caught her eye in the mirror and said, "We need to leave. Right now." I thought she would be like, "What? You're being ridiculous," or what have you, but instead she said, "I know." My blood ran cold when she said it. We left so quickly that we just grabbed what was in front of us. We booked it out of her house and down the driveway, which we weren't supposed to be on. Her mom had just had it repaved, and her car was parked down on the street. We rounded the curve in the driveway and there was an SUV parked dead center in the middle of the street without its lights on. Suddenly, the lights turned on full blast, the SUV blared its horn and took off. We scrambled the rest of the way down, totally ruining the new paving, and were getting into her car and calling the police when her mom pulled up right behind us. To this day, I do not know if it was a robber or what, but the fact that she and I both got the sense of dread at the exact same time creeps me out to no end. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more daily videos, and join the Spooky Squad.